welcome to GameTime Episode 3. I'm Jay White, and I'm going to take you through today's episode, which is all about Muskets and Tomahawks. Before we begin, however, I'd just like to say, to those of you who have subscribed to our channel on YouTube, or for those of you who are joining us for the first time in this episode, thank you very much for watching. It's your viewership that's really driving our motivation to keep doing these episodes, so thank you very much. Muskets and Tomahawks is a game that's focused on skirmishes in North America during the 18th century. What that really means is the French and Indian War, which is what my collection's focused on here and what we'll use for today's game, and the American Revolution. The rules were written by Alex Buchel and Fred Michaud of Studio Tomahawk and released in 2012. These names may sound familiar because they've also written Saga, which is a popular Dark Age skirmish game and something we'll be covering in a future episode. Today's episode's been broken into 3 parts for your viewing pleasure. And part 1, we're going to focus on the game components, that is the terrain and the miniatures and the components you need to play Muskets and Tomahawks. In part 2, we're going to cover how to play the game, so a very good overview or walkthrough of a game turn. And then in part 3, both myself and Roy Scaife are going to throw down on my 4x4 table here in a 400-point full game of Muskets and Tomahawks, and then you, the viewer, can watch all the blood, guts, and glory from front to back of a complete game. So stay tuned, let's zoom in here and take a closer look. Alright, now that we can see the whole table here, let's talk about the miniatures that I use, the game components I have, and the terrain that I've used on the table here. Of course, what you'll need to play the game is a tape measure, very few markers. I have some flight markers here. You'll need some sort of some black powder markers or to mark that your units have fired. I'm a big fan of the Warlord firepower lights or the volley lights here that you can kind of click and they light up and they add a lot of flavor to your battles here, but those are great. You'll want some individual cotton balls, which is a very cheap way to show individual units that have fired. So some cotton balls, a tape measure, a bunch of 6-sided dice, and your army list, so to say. And so what I've done for my army list is off my blog site, Jay's Wargaming Madness. I kind of did up these generic rosters. I've just kind of printed them off. I fill out my troop stats and then I laminate them and kind of keep them off to the side. And so that's an easy way to kind of keep track of your units. And as you play different games, if you cut them out individually, you can mix and match. Let's talk about miniatures. I've got a whole bunch of different manufacturers that I've used to fill things out over the years. Primarily, or my primary miniature manufacturer at the time when I started collecting was Conquest Miniatures. And so all my regulars here, my Grenadiers for the British, my regulars for the French and British, my Marines for the French, my Indians, some of my settlers, my Rangers are all Conquest Miniatures. You're probably going to know them better now that as Warlord. Their French and Indian range for Warlord is all Conquest Miniatures behind the scenes. And so that's the bulk of my figures. My flags I get from GMB Flags or GMB Designs. GMB does, in my opinion, the finest miniature flags out there for the period and several other periods as well. They're just gorgeous. You get them out and they really take your miniatures to the next level if you use their flags. So that's most of my regulars here. There's, of course, several ranges that have come out since I started collecting, and I've kind of put them in here for one reason or another. We'll first talk about civilians here. So I did mention Conquest Miniatures or Warlord as getting some of my civilians from them. Perry does some great civilians for their American War of Independence medal range, so I'd take a look there. You can get some civilians for both settlers, kind of American frontier settlers, and Indians from Redoubt Enterprises. I'd also note that Conquest or Warlord also does some Indian civilians as well. And so I have civilians for Indians, I have civilians for Americans and colonials and all that. And they're very integral to most of the scenarios because a lot of scenarios are defend the civilians or go slaughter the civilians or try to prevent them from slaughtering civilians. So it's going to be important to have at least a few of those models. The next thing that's up is my Perry Wagons, and one of the things I just love about the Perry Miniatures line is the kind of extras that they do to fill out their medals. And so I got all 3 of their kind of primary carts for the 18th century from their American War of Independence range, and these are just gorgeous carts. The cargo comes out here, you could of course glue it in, but maybe this is sitting here and the cart needs to come pick it up and escape with it. There's all sorts of neat stuff you can do with carts, and they just look beautiful when they're done up and on a base here. So that's the civilians. Most of my regulars are from Conquest Miniatures. At the time, it was very hard to find British Highlanders for the period. There's a few that have come out since. I've heard rumors that Conquest Miniatures is going to release some Highlanders. Nick at North Star Military Figures, He's done some Highlanders which look really great. They came out way after I got mine, unfortunately. So my Highlanders come from Redoubt Enterprises, which are also great figures. They have a very robust, Redoubt Enterprises has a very robust French and Indian War range. So I have my Highlanders from there, and I've got Highlander Grenadiers, an officer, several regular units, and that's Redoubt Enterprises. North Star military figures, I've got some Canadian militia from them. Like I mentioned, they released some Highlanders. They're doing some incremental sets for Muskets and Tomahawks specifically, so I definitely take a look at them. The majority of my Canadian militia actually mixed North Star military figures with Galloping Major. And Galloping Major does some American Rangers, which are beautiful figures. They do Indians, they do colonial settlers, as well as provincials and Canadian militia. And so there's some great figures there. Another manufacturer not to be left behind is Crusader Miniatures. And so this officer for my French here, if you want a couple of different options for that, actually comes from Crusader Miniatures. I'd say that's from their French 7 Years War line. So they don't have a specific French and Indian War line. And so that's most of them. There's, of course, other manufacturers out there. I don't have any Blue Moon manufacturing myself. They do have a French and Indian War line. If you look at my blog, Jay's Wargaming Madness, there's a thread or a post called FIW Comparative Figure Size. So if you want to see how the different ranges stack up, or even just what the different ranges are, you can go track down that particular post, and it will show you all the links and what they look like all side by side with kind of a 28mm line through it. Of course, this is all 28mm. There's several lines of 15mm that are available, and Muskets and Tomahawks can also be played in that scale with very little issue. In fact, there's several threads where you see guys playing in 15mm. You can get buildings for 15mm from Foreground for the period as well that look beautiful. So if that's your scale, have at it. For me, I like the epic feel of 28mm, and so that's pretty much what all my ranges are at this point. A little bit about the scenery you see on here. So these are Lemax snake fencing that come pre-assembled. I kind of painted them up and fixed them because they certainly don't come like this. I've been told that the Lemax snake fencing range has been discontinued, and so that's unfortunate. The good news is that there's lots of other places to get snake fencing. You can build these out of balsa wood fairly simply, or if you look at Rendra has some plastic snake fencing available as well, so it's not too hard to track this stuff down. My cornfields here come from a place I want to call Battlefield Scenics. I can't quite remember off the top of my head, but I got these. These are one of the first kind of pieces of specific terrain I got, and again, they don't come like this. I had to base them like this. But I'm not a big fan of these. In fact, I'm in the process of replacing these with O-scale corn stalks for trains that look way more realistic and are way cheap. Well, maybe not cheaper, but about the same cost, and it looks just way better. So I'd recommend O-scale corn stalks, and take a look online for those. A lot of my scenery that's on the table here is from Architects of War, which is a company out of the US. They do primarily resin terrain with metal bits. And of course it doesn't come finished, you'd have to finish it yourself. But my turnip field here, this pigsty actually comes with pigs that I haven't done yet. All of my tree bases, which are all resin plates here, this big tree as well, all come from Architects of War, as well as the plowed field. And what's really great about them is you can buy their base plates here, which are really solid. They don't bend because it's resin. You can buy it with or without the tree. So if you have a bunch of trees already, you can just buy the plates. They come with lots of texture. You can finish them up and they look great. The other thing is that I have 4 of their kind of forest sets, which come with 4 plates each. And when you kind of mix and match them together, you can combine them. You can see I have 2 large plates that are back to back here to kind of create a large kind of forest over here. So it really gives you the kind of versatility to lay your forest out how you want. Like I said, I generally play on a 4x8 table, and I have 4 of their wood sets, which is pretty much enough to kind of fill that up with other things. Their stone walls are just spectacular. So here's the Architects of War stone walls. What's great about them is, number one, they look really great. But that aside, is they have these kind of locking teeth that go together. So if I want it to be straight, I can make it straight. But if I want it to be a corner, I just turn it and it looks like a corner. It's not like 2 straight pieces I've tried to make look like a corner. And so I don't have to have either that really kind of odd look of 2 straight pieces connected, and I don't have to maintain separate corner pieces. So all of my stone walls are generally useful regardless of what configuration I want to create. They also give you little finishing pieces like these to help kind of finish off your stone walls and not just leave them hanging out in the middle of nowhere. And so that's really great. I highly suggest if you like these and you go with the stone walls, you get the Overgrown stone walls, which is this set here. I've got a couple of these to go with 3 or 4 sets of their stone walls. And these are great when you want to transition to their hedgerows here, their hedge lines, which is another resin plate. Comes with the rocks all sculpted in and the foliage and the trees to finish them off. So if you want to kind of transition into these, this is a great way to do it, and then it comes out as a stone wall on the other side. Beautiful terrain, very, very modular. You can use it for multiple periods. And you'll see these in almost all of my games as I go through and do the various periods. These fields here are just kind of your generic kind of staticky grass type of fields that you find from various distributors. I'm actually not a big fan, especially since these have kind of they've thinned out over here on the side. I'm actually going to replace these with teddy bear fur that I'm going to shave down and do kind of, it looks much better, much more natural, and of course you can paint it up and it looks really nice if you want to make it a different color, but it comes in this kind of natural brown color anyways. So I'm going to replace this with teddy bear fur, but in the meantime I've kind of got these cheapy ones that I just threw out here for wheat fields. Gale Force 9 does my, or the Battlefield in a Box does my river here, and of course I static grassed it. They do their ponds and swamps. I have some of those as well. And they also do these kind of rocky outcrops. This one I've kind of highlighted up a bit with the same gray that I used on my stone walls here, which is the slate gray from Foundry, if you're familiar with the Foundry paint sets from Wargames Foundry. And static grassed and tufted. I have a bunch of the Wilderness tufts that I used for my ranges here. I also used it for my basing on my regular troops here. And that's kind of it. That's all the things that are represented on the table here, except for the buildings. I do have a bunch of foreground buildings for the period that I've got on bases. I need to finish the bases, and they're really spectacular. When I started building my collection, of course, they weren't out. And so what I did go with is Pegasus Hobbies here in the U.S. distributes these, I think they're called museum models. And they do a Russian front log cabin, and of course this comes with a thatch roof, not a plank roof here. And all I did was use mat board to build my own roof for it, and then I used cereal box kind of thickness cardboard to cut out the roofing tiles here in strips and lay it down. I also used the same mat board to build the floor inside here, and I scored it with an X-Acto knife to kind of show the planks, and then of course finished it all inside. This building right here cost about $6, $7. And US dollars, that is, and so it's very cheap when you think about it. They have other sets that are about $5 or $6 for 2 buildings, and so for about $20, $25, I had 7 buildings, painted them up, got them based, and they look really great for the period. All you have to do is kind of replace the roofs on them, and you can go inside of them and fight battles inside and outside, and so that's a really key thing for the period. You don't want those kind of solid block resin buildings, because buildings are going to be a big part of the game. And so museum models through Pegasus Hobbies, some great sets for some low-cost alternatives to buildings. Of course, Foreground, in my opinion, does the best kind of period buildings out there for not only the French and Indian War, but several other periods. I have a bunch of Foreground buildings. The last thing on here is the Rendra pontoon bridge that you can see over here. I, of course, didn't put the pontoons down, so this is the alternate thing that you can do with that bridge, which is just use it for a regular wooden bridge. Very cheap, plastic. You can get it done really quick. It's low cost, and it goes over your Gale Force 9 river pretty easily. Great, so that's pretty much everything I got out on the board here in terms of miniatures, terrain, and game components that I use to play Muskets and Tomahawks. I guess, and one last thing I might point out here is this is called a dice shield here, which I use for a bunch of my games. It comes with legs of different sizes, and of course they can come off. You can just put it flat down, so it's great for board games and miniature games. But it's a place to roll your dice. It comes with a little kind of clear plastic sheet at the bottom here to cut down on the noise and the bouncing in the plastic here. But Questo Gizmo builds these, and he's a local guy in San Francisco here, so I pick him up just from the local cons, and he's a great guy. But if you're wondering what this is called a dice shield, and this is what we use for kind of rolling our dice in. And the great thing about the legs is you can put it over your miniatures if you wanted to throw it out inside of the thing here, or if I wanted to throw it over a piece of terrain like here, I can do that and it's not going to wreck anything. In fact, the legs are even high enough to go over a lot of my tree bases here. And so that's what's cool about this little dice shield. Great. So let's move on and go through how do you play Muskets and Tomahawks and look at the rules. So that's coming up in part 2 here.